Remember 2008? Everything just seemed to go haywire. You turn on the TV and it's just crisis after crisis. And honestly, trying to figure out what really happened, it was like, well, grasping at straws.
Yeah, a lot of confusion at that time. Everybody looking for answers, wondering how did this happen to the global economy?
Right, exactly. And that's what we're getting into today. We've got this Woods-Meltdown.pdf, and we're going to cut through the noise, see if we can identify the core arguments about what triggered this massive economic shock. Trying to give everyone a clear picture of the underlying causes without getting bogged down.
This source really offers a very specific perspective. It places a lot of emphasis on the role of the government, especially the Federal Reserve, in kind of creating the conditions for this meltdown.
Yeah, the author really makes a connection between government actions and things like the housing bubble, that huge Wall Street bailout, and these repeating boom and bust cycles we see. So let's start with that, the housing bubble. I mean, the typical story starts with people defaulting on their mortgages, right? That's what seemed to kick it all off.
That's certainly where the unraveling became visible, where the problems kind of burst into the open. But this book argues that the real causes, the roots of this, go a lot deeper. It points to government policies and actions that kind of fundamentally reshaped the whole housing market in the years leading up to this.
And a big part of that argument focuses on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Can you tell us why they were so important in this story?
The key thing to understand about Fannie and Freddie is their unique, almost hybrid nature. They were part private, part government, which gave them certain advantages like tax breaks, less stringent regulations compared to, say, private lenders. But maybe the most crucial factor was this widespread belief that if they ever really got into trouble, the government would always be there to bail them out.
So it's almost like they were too big to fail, even before that term became so common.
Yeah. And that belief essentially removed a lot of the normal market discipline, encouraging them to take bigger risks, maybe, than they would have in a truly free market, because the potential downside seems smaller, right?
Yeah, it makes sense that they could attract a lot more investment to housing because the risk appeared lower than it actually was.
Exactly. And the book goes on to highlight how the government was actively pushing to increase homeownership rates. It mentions HUD secretaries like Cisneros under Clinton and Cuomo pointing to policies aimed at, well, easing lending standards and really changing how risk was assessed when it came to mortgages.
Right, there was that big push to make owning a home more accessible to everyone, but the book's suggesting that even with those good intentions, there were some unintended consequences, right?
Absolutely. And the Community Reinvestment Act, the CRA, also plays into this. Officially, it applied to banks and other depository institutions, but the basic idea behind it, this idea of broader access to credit, especially in communities that had been historically underserved, it really permeated the entire mortgage lending landscape.
So all those agencies, Fannie, Freddie, HUD, even the Fed, they kind of adopted a more lenient, a more relaxed approach to lending overall.
Yeah, that's the argument. It wasn't just about those subprime mortgages that everyone talks about. It was a more widespread shift in how lending was being done across the board.
A changing of the culture of lending, maybe.
Yeah, and that really paved the way for some very risky lending practices to become, I guess, normalized. Things like 100% loans where people didn't even need a down payment to buy a house.
It's hard to imagine that happening today. And then on top of that, we had the Federal Reserve, right? The book talks about their role in all this, particularly the low interest rates they were maintaining and how that fueled this housing boom.
The key thing to remember is that the Fed's low interest rate policy pumped a lot of reserves, a lot of money, into the banking system. This made it very attractive for banks to lend that money out, further pushing up demand in the housing market. And the author points out that things like tax breaks for homeowners, they also played a part. The government was essentially stimulating demand for housing in several ways, making it seem like an even more appealing investment than it might have been otherwise.
So you have this confluence of factors all kind of pushing in the same direction, which brings in the Austrian perspective, a perspective that the book really emphasizes. Can you talk a little bit about their view on these, what they would call artificially low interest rates?
Yeah, the Austrian School of Economics argues that when interest rates are held artificially low, meaning they're lower than what they would be if the market were setting them, based on savings and investment, well, that creates distortion. It sends these misleading signals throughout the economy, leading businesses and investors to make decisions that might not make sense in the long run.
almost like a mirage leading people in the wrong direction.
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
Like, imagine a situation where businesses are encouraged to take on these big long-term projects because borrowing money seems really cheap. But what if that's not based on a real increase in savings or true consumer demand?
It's like building a house on a foundation of sand, right? It looks solid at first, but then
Exactly. You end up with this misallocation of resources. Businesses invest in projects that may not actually be sustainable, and that pulls resources away from other areas where they might have been more productively used. And the book points out, even as this housing bubble is inflating, even as all these warning signs are flashing, you have people like Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan reassuring the public that everything's fine.
which in hindsight is always a little unnerving to look back on. And of course, eventually the bubble bursts. And that takes us to the Great Wall Street bailout. So the government's first reaction, it's bailouts and promises of tighter regulation.
Yeah, the too big to fail argument really comes to the forefront here. Yeah, we see the bailout of Bear Stearns, orchestrated by the Fed and JP Morgan. And then there's the massive AIG bailout, largely because they were so deeply involved in those credit default swaps, basically insurance policies on investments, and suddenly they had to pay out huge amounts.
And these were presented as necessary steps, right? Like the whole financial system would collapse if they didn't do this. But the book has a different perspective.
The book asks a really important question. What happens when you prevent these big failures? Does it actually make the system stronger or more fragile? The argument is that letting unprofitable businesses fail, it's painful in the short term, but it allows for resources, capital, and labor to be reallocated to healthier companies.
So it's kind of a creative destruction process.
Exactly. And they use the example of Lehman Brothers, a major investment bank that was allowed to go bankrupt. And the author points out that this didn't lead to the complete meltdown that many people had predicted.
It's almost like a controlled burn in a forest. Gets rid of the dead wood so the healthy trees can thrive. Then we have the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008, that $700 billion fund. The original plan was to buy all those toxic assets, right?
Yeah, that was the initial strategy. Secretary Paulson was pushing hard for buying these troubled assets to, I guess, unclog the system and get banks lending to each other again. But then, pretty much as soon as the bill passed, the focus shifted to injecting capital directly into banks.
So a pretty dramatic shift in strategy there. And it did feel like they were making it up as they went along to some extent. And the scale of the intervention, it's almost hard to comprehend. The book mentions a total of $7.7 trillion by the end of 2008.
It was an unprecedented level of government involvement in the economy. The author even quotes Hugo Chavez, of all people, reacting to this. He found it ironic that a country that's supposed to be all about free markets was suddenly buying up shares in private banks.
It really shows you just how deeply the government had stepped into the financial system at that point. And the messaging, it was kind of all over the place, right? One minute they're telling banks to lend more, then criticizing them for being reckless, then urging them to lend again.
It was confusing, for sure. And the Fed was creating all these new lending programs, TAF, TSLF, PDCF, pumping money into the system. But the book argues that these bailouts, they actually slowed down the necessary deleveraging process.
Can you explain what you mean by deleveraging?
Think of it like a household that's accumulated a lot of debt. They need to cut back their spending, pay down their debts. That's deleveraging. And these big financial firms, well, they needed to do the same thing. But by offering them a safety net, the government essentially reduced their urgency to clean up their balance sheets.
They could just wait for a bailout instead of taking those painful steps to get back on solid ground.
Exactly. And it wasn't just banks that got bailed out. That mindset seemed to extend to other industries, like the auto companies.
So it wasn't a targeted response to a specific problem. It was a broader shift in how the government viewed its role in the economy, maybe.
That's what the book suggests. And it reiterates that the decline in housing prices, that wasn't the problem in itself. It was a symptom of those prices being artificially inflated in the first place by the Fed's loose monetary policy. That's what set the whole stage for the crisis.
So the book is really laying a lot of blame at the feet of government intervention. And that leads us to the next big topic, the boom-bust cycle, and how the government might actually be causing it. This is where the Austrian theory of economics really comes in.
The Austrian perspective offers a different way of looking at these cycles. It sees the central bank, the Federal Reserve in the U.S., as a major driver of this boom-bust pattern. And it all comes down to their ability to manipulate the money supply and interest rates.
And the book points out that these busts, these downturns, they tend to be especially severe in industries that produce capital goods, things like factories and machinery. Why is that?
Well, the Austrian theory says that when interest rates are artificially low, it makes those long-term investments in capital goods industries look very attractive because borrowing costs are low, right? But the problem is this investment isn't necessarily aligned with what consumers really want or need. It's a misallocation of resources driven by distorted price signals.
Right. It's that concept of malinvestment that we talked about earlier.
Yeah. The book uses a great analogy about a home builder. Imagine a builder gets a signal, a false signal, that tells him there's huge demand for new houses and that all the resources he needs are readily available. So he starts building like crazy more houses than the market can actually support.
It's like that mirage in the desert again, leading you astray.
Exactly. He's acting on bad information. The sooner he realizes his mistake, the less damage there will be. But if he keeps building based on this false signal, the eventual correction is going to be much more painful.
So the boom is like building all those extra houses based on that bad information, and the bust is the inevitable reality check.
Precisely. All that apparent prosperity of the boom, with rising stock prices and real estate values, it's an illusion. It's not sustainable. Those malinvestments eventually have to be liquidated, and that's where the recession or depression comes in. And the book really cautions against trying to prolong the boom by injecting more money into the system. It just makes the eventual correction even worse.
Kicking the can down the road, but the can keeps getting bigger. And the book contrasts the recovery from the Depression of 1921, where the government largely stayed out of the way, with Japan's experience in the 1990s, where they tried to prop up asset prices and ended up with decades of stagnation.
Yeah, those are two really important examples. In the early 1920s, the U.S. had a sharp downturn, but because they didn't try to interfere too much, the economy was able to readjust fairly quickly. Japan, on the other hand, they tried to fight the natural correction mechanisms, and they ended up stuck in a rut for a long time. And the housing boom of the 2000s, from this Austrian perspective, is a classic example of malinvestment driven by artificially low interest rates.
Now, one question I have is, wouldn't businesses be able to tell the difference between natural low interest rates and these artificial ones? How does the book address that?
The author points out that we have artificial interest rates. It distorts price signals throughout the entire economy. It's not just one sector. So it becomes very difficult, even for experienced business owners, to really know what's going on. They're operating in this kind of funhouse mirror world where it's hard to tell what's real and what's not.
And the book brings up the dot-com boom as another example of this Austrian theory in action.
That's right. All that easy money flowing around in the late 1990s, it fueled a lot of unsustainable investment in internet companies. Savings rates were low, household debt was rising, but investment kept pouring in, driven by those low interest rates. And then when the dot-com bubble burst, what did the Fed do? They lowered interest rates even further, which the book argues set the stage for the housing bubble.
So you have these manias like the dot-com craze, where investors get caught up in the excitement, but it's the Federal Reserve, with its control over the money supply, that's providing the fuel for the fire.
Right. The Fed isn't necessarily creating the mania itself, but they're creating the environment where those manias can flourish.
So the book is really presenting a very different view of how these events unfolded and how they connect to each other. And that takes us to the section on the Great Depression, which challenges some pretty fundamental beliefs about that period.
This section directly challenges the conventional wisdom that Hoover's laissez-faire policies caused the Great Depression, and that FDR's New Deal policies rescued the economy. The book argues that these boom-bust cycles, they've been a recurring theme in American history, and they were often associated with periods of rapid credit expansion, even before the Fed existed.
And it highlights the Depression of 1921 as a really important case study.
That period is crucial because it shows a sharp but relatively quick recovery after an inflationary boom. And the government largely stayed out of the way, which is in stark contrast to what happened during the Great Depression.
So the book's argument is that the seeds of the Great Depression were actually sown during the boom of the 1920s, not by a lack of government action in the 1930s.
Exactly. And it goes on to say that Hoover's interventions, things like price controls and trying to maintain wages at a certain level, that these actually made the Depression worse.
Trying to hold back the tide, so to speak.
Yeah, and then it critiques FDR's New Deal, suggesting that programs like agricultural price supports, cartelization, public works projects, that these actually hindered the recovery by distorting market signals and preventing the necessary liquidation of malinvestments.
It's a very different interpretation of the New Deal than what a lot of people learn in school. And the book points out that the strong economic recovery of the 1940s, well, that coincided with a partial rollback of those New Deal policies.
Yeah, an interesting correlation there. And the book challenges this idea that the money supply was too low during the Depression, pointing out that there were similar contractions in the money supply during earlier periods that didn't result in such prolonged suffering.
So it's not just about the quantity of money, but also about how it's being used and how it's being managed.
Right. And it takes on the war brings prosperity argument, the idea that World War II is what pulled the U.S. out of the Depression. The book points out that wartime production that's driven by government demand, not necessarily by consumer demand, and that the real growth came after the war when the private sector was able to start producing for consumers again.
Really forces you to reconsider those conventional narratives. Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about money itself, which is at the heart of all this. The book talks about fiat money versus commodity money. Can you explain the difference?
The key difference is what backs the currency. Commodity money, like gold or silver, has inherent value or represents a claim on something tangible. Fiat money, on the other hand, it's not redeemable for any commodity. Its value is based on government decree and the public's willingness to accept it.
So it's all about trust in the government, essentially.
Yeah, in a way. And the book traces the history of this evolution from commodity money to paper money that was originally redeemable for gold or silver, and then to the system we have today with unbacked fiat currency.
And the book argues that governments tend to prefer fiat money systems. Why is that?
It gives them a lot more flexibility. With fiat money, they're not limited by the amount of gold or silver they have. They can increase the money supply more easily, which allows for more government spending, but it also creates the potential for inflation.
Which is the topic of the next section.
Yeah.
And the book ties this into fractional reserve banking and how that system actually creates money.
Right. In a fractional reserve system, banks are only required to keep a fraction of their deposits on hand. This allows them to lend out the rest, which creates new money in the form of loans. And that process is amplified by the Fed's ability to inject reserves into the system.
So it's not just the government printing money, it's the banks creating money through lending.
Exactly. And the book defines inflation as an increase in the money supply. Rising prices, they're a consequence of that.
Not just rising prices, but rising prices caused by too much money chasing too few goods, essentially.
Right. And the book also explains how inflation can redistribute wealth. It benefits those who get their hands on the new money first. And it can discourage saving because the value of your savings erodes over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. If prices are going up faster than your savings are growing, you're losing purchasing power.
Exactly. And there's a section that critiques this idea that the Fed should be constantly injecting credit into the economy.
Like a doctor giving a patient a blood transfusion.
Yeah. But the book argues that the Fed doesn't actually have real resources to inject. Credit has to come from real savings. You can't just create it out of thin air.
So printing more money isn't a solution to an economic problem. It might just create new problems.
That's the argument. And then the book takes on some of the common arguments against using gold as money.
Yeah, like the argument that it's too heavy and inconvenient to carry around.
They address that by pointing to modern technology, things like electronic clearing systems and debit cards. They also counter the argument that gold is too costly to produce by saying that cost isn't the main issue. The real advantage of gold is that it prevents governments from manipulating the currency.
It takes that power out of their hands.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they talk about the limited supply of gold and how that doesn't necessarily hinder growth. The value of money can adjust, and they argue that falling prices, what they call growth deflation, can actually be a good thing.
That's a pretty counterintuitive idea, right? We're so used to thinking that falling prices are a sign of a bad economy.
The book makes the case that falling prices can be a result of increased efficiency and productivity, which is good for consumers, or they can be a healthy correction after a period of inflation. And they even point to historical examples of deflation that didn't lead to economic depression.
So it's not always a doom and gloom scenario. And that leads us to the final section, what now? What are the book's recommendations for the future?
The book starts by challenging this idea that consumer spending is the engine of economic growth.
Yeah.
It criticizes that spend if you love America mentality.
The idea that we can shop our way out of a recession.
Yeah, exactly. The book emphasizes that production is what makes consumption possible, and that trying to artificially boost consumption during a downturn, it can actually make things worse.
Because it prevents those necessary adjustments from happening.
Right. And the book reiterates the call to get rid of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They see those institutions as major sources of distortion in the housing market.
So less government involvement in the housing market is a key recommendation.
Absolutely. And the author is very skeptical of any talk of change that simply involves more bailouts and more government intervention.
So not just tweaking the system, but fundamentally rethinking the role of government in the economy,
Right. And a core message is drastically reducing government spending.
cutting back on those deficits.
Exactly. The book argues that government deficit spending can put pressure on the Fed to create more money, which devalues the currency. And they even go so far as to say that money is the most socialized sector of the U.S. economy, and that we need to end government manipulation of it.
Wow, a pretty radical statement. And what about the Federal Reserve itself? What does the book propose?
The author suggests that we need to have a serious conversation about the role of the Federal Reserve, and they advocate for allowing interest rates to float freely, to be determined by the market, rather than being set by a central authority. The argument is that a truly free market can't coexist with a central bank controlling the money supply.
So it all comes down to having more faith in the market and less faith in government intervention. And the book concludes by highlighting the Austrian economists who have been warning about these things for decades, and whose predictions, according to the author, turned out to be quite accurate.
The book really emphasizes learning from the past and understanding that the best way to avoid these booms and busts is to not create the artificial booms in the first place,
Right.
to abandon this idea that the Fed can somehow fine-tune the economy.
Right. So this deep dive into Woods-Meltdown.pdf, it really presents a perspective that sees government intervention, especially through the Federal Reserve, as playing a key role, a negative role, in the 2008 financial crisis.
It's a perspective that focuses on the dangers of artificially low interest rates, the misallocation of resources that results from that, and the unintended consequences of things like bailouts and increased regulation.
A lot of food for thought there. And it leaves us with a big question. Considering these arguments, how would our understanding of current economic challenges change if we were to look more critically at central banking and government intervention? Something to ponder, for sure. The book encourages people to explore the ideas of Austrian economists like Mises, Hayek, and Rothbard, and resources like Mises.org for a deeper understanding. We hope this conversation has given you some valuable insights into this complex and very important topic.